Yeah, so I'm Damian Maye. So I work at the CCRI as a Professor of Agri-Food Studies, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the Living Lab methodology, particularly in relation to quite a large European Horizon 2020 project that we've just completed called Robust. You can see the funding for it at the bottom there. So the project was designed to find ways to strengthen rural and urban linkages. So we were using this particular methodology with that in mind. So before I forget, just to acknowledge some CCRI colleagues who've worked with me. So Matt, Dan, Brian, who was also involved initially through the Wales case study, which I'll talk about, but also other colleagues, particularly Hannah Skirker, who was the coordinator at Wageningen, Marina Nickel, who helped a lot with the evaluation side of the work. So what I've decided to do in 40 minutes, so Julie's going to shut me up if I go beyond that. I'll try to be a little bit quicker if I can. Is that how you move the slides, Julie, or is it that way? Let's do it. Yeah. Should I try that one again? I've got to do that each time. Oh, it's working now. There we go. Great. Okay, fine. So I've divided it into 5 sections just to walk you through the process. So I'm going to start off by just saying a little bit about where the idea comes from and introduce some principles that I think are quite important when you think about using this type of methodology. Then I'm going to introduce you very briefly to the Robust project and what I call the 4 E's framework for living lab co-innovation. So it's a bit wordy, but this is basically how we developed our methodology for this project. Then I'm going to give you some examples, walk you through that framework, talk about the processes and outcomes, and then I'm going to try and be a bit more reflective and think about the different types of pathways that have emerged out of our work, and at the end draw some wider conclusions for how we might want to think about doing this type of work going forward in the context of multi-actor working. So that will hopefully be helpful to everybody. So just to start then, the living lab concepts, the origins of it are actually within what they call user-driven ICT system development. So development, I guess, of things like mobile phones and stuff, where you actually get users involved in the development of new technologies. So it started out as a kind of technical innovation. But when you look in the literature, there isn't actually any uniform definition of living labs, but they kind of break down into 2 types. One is a kind of, people talk about different forms of partnership with universities, but also private and civil society partnerships working together. They can also be kind of demonstrations, so kind of piloting, both technical and, as you'll see in a moment, social innovations as well. So when we were getting into the project and trying to figure out what the heck a living lab was, we drew quite a lot on this paper by Wojtenko and colleagues, which was published in 2016 in the Journal of Cleaner Production. It actually publishes some quite interesting papers despite the name of the journal. And this was one of them, and they define living labs in 2 ways. Firstly, as what they call an arena. So in other words, it's kind of geographically bounded, usually at, I would say, something like the district scale. So it tends to be kind of community district level scale, but also as an approach for what they call intentional collaborative experimentation. And as you can see there, involving a range of different actors and citizens. I'm going to actually argue that this emphasis on experimentation is really important, and I think it may get a little bit underplayed sometimes when we think about living labs. When you look at the literature, there's quite a lot of literature now around urban living labs. Some of this is initiated through some quite large funding programs in Europe, for example, and they are all trying to do collective forms of governance experimentation. Quite a lot of it's framed around sustainability challenges, particularly in relation to climate change. And they're not just technological. So they started out like that, but now there's quite a broad range of experimental work, including social innovations and including kind of justice-orientated community-led research. So particularly if you look at how the concept is applied, I would say in North America, it's quite interesting in terms of a stronger kind of justice and equity angle to some of their work. So what we drew on particularly was these 5 principles that came out from this Voitenko paper, which talk about, these are kind of principles, or you could also think of them as characteristics that are important when you're thinking about implementing this type of methodology. So the first one relates to this idea of geographical embeddedness. So these are kind of place-centered, place-based innovations. Experimentation and co-learning are critical as well in terms of, so that could be kind of policy-orientated experimentation. The other aspect then is that it's co-experimentation. So participation and user involvement is another really critical feature. So I always think of things like co-innovation, co-production. Those words actually mean things if you're trying to truly implement a living lab methodology, rather than just a standard case study, for instance. Then there's other stuff which is quite interesting in terms of having some ownership and leadership of the lab. So in some of the literature, it suggests that usually universities take quite a strong lead in living labs, but they can also be more collaborative as well. And evaluation and refinement of your innovation is another critical principle to kind of build into the design of the work that you do. So they're kind of iterative processes, and that's kind of what we try to do in the Robust project, as I'll show you in the next few slides. So the Robust project then, very briefly, you can see there the overall goals of what we were trying to achieve with the project. It was a very big project. It was quite ambitious. So we had this idea of kind of advancing understanding of how we strengthen links between the rural and the urban, particularly coming from a rural perspective. So trying to read it from that perspective rather than a kind of urban dominated perspective. And one of the ways that we were trying to do that was to look at promising governance models and practices that could create these mutual beneficial relationships. So what we kind of majored on in the project, or at least we tried to as the team that were leading this living lab work, was this idea of, if we take the principles of living labs, then we really need to think about experimentation. So that is about visioning future systems, looking for creative governance solutions. And that's what we constantly push the teams to be thinking about. There's some literature which actually is about experimental governance, and there's also literature in the climate change work, which is about kind of what they call green innovation in terms of experimental governance in climate change. So there's a couple of references there that I've put in. The other thing to note is that our living lab approach was combined with 5 communities of practice, and I'll show you those, how they worked in a moment. But what we were doing was, because it was such a broad area, we specified 5 functions of rural-urban linkage that we focused on. So for instance, food, ecosystem services, business models and labour markets, infrastructure and cultural connections. So these were the 11 labs that constituted the Robust project. The key thing is that each of them is a partnership between a research institute and a practice partner. Many of the practice partners, as you can see there on the list, were from kind of local or regional government. So that's quite important to think about in terms of how we work together and what we were able to achieve and not achieve. But that was the combination that we went with. Quite a diversity of labs in terms of you know, quite large areas like Frankfurt, for instance, compared to some areas which were much more rural. So the Wales team, for instance, was operating in mid Wales, a very rural area. So quite a bit of geographical diversity in the 11 labs that we were working with. And then the theory was that within each of those labs, you then selected 3 of the 5 functions. And so there was a kind of cross learning at a thematic level as well. So you were kind of taking that kind of grounded knowledge from your lab and sharing it with other teams that were, for instance, in the Gloucestershire case, working on business models, food systems, and ecosystem services. So that was the kind of theory of it all. And I think it kind of worked, but other colleagues might have a different view. So this is basically our kind of 4E's co-production framework, our living lab methodology. So what we did, we kind of absorbed some of the messages from the broader literature and created a kind of pathway for co-innovation, if you like, really, for each of the labs to work through. So the first phase, we call it the envisioning phase, which is about really the identification of needs and the development of an innovation strategy that's co-developed between colleagues in each lab. That then comes down to what we call a kind of experimenting phase. So this is where you really should be starting to get into your experimental governance. What are the key innovations that you want to focus on, that you want to test? Do some preliminary thought experiments and so forth around that. And then that trickles down then into a deeper, what we call experiencing phase, where you're really doing deeper analysis of trends, of shadowing, of deeper qualitative work and so on. And then running across all of that as an ongoing process is the evaluating phase, which is as much as anything about monitoring, but monitoring doesn't begin with an E, so we called it evaluating. But it's kind of this iterative cycle of keeping track of the goals that you set, whether you're achieving them, do we need to adjust them, etc. So we kind of built this broad level framework and then developed a series of tools to help each lab work through that process. So what I'm going to do is kind of walk you through each of those phases so you can get a sense of how we did it. I'm not necessarily suggesting this is the blueprint, but this is how we tried to mobilize it in the robust project. So as part of the envisioning phase, we set up a couple of things to help each team. The first of which was to build a multi-methods toolkit, which sounds a bit grand, but basically we focused more on participatory research tools, given the nature of the approach that we were developing. And we prepared a summary sheet for each of those methods. We emphasized that it was not a prescriptive process, but it was to be used as a resource that teams could build on to do their own joint learning and co-design. And then we also created what we called a research and innovation agenda. So again, each lab was tasked with co-developing an agenda together. And we suggested that they might come up with a motto for their lab, for example, that they might agree some priorities, assumed it was going to be a pretty smooth process. Didn't quite work out like that. Many of them spent several hours, particularly our Italian colleagues, in very intense dialogue about what it was they were trying to do. So even this process itself was actually quite interesting and at times quite tense. So just to give you a sense of that, so this is like a summary sheet. I don't know if you can see it from the top there, but basically what we produced, those list of methods on the left. And in the document, we suggested that, you could select these accordingly. So some of them may be more appropriate. Say, for example, that joint visioning thing would be a good thing to do in the envisioning phase. That was the basic idea, really. But it was just a resource that the teams could then draw on. So we had a go at using appreciative inquiry, which I didn't know what it was before I started doing this project. In our Gloucestershire lab, for example, groups used some standard things like focus groups and interviews, and they even included scenarios and all sorts of different things. But I think the idea is to give the labs flexibility in what they want to do as research teams. So I'll stop working now, Julie, how come? Do you want to try it again? Oh, there we go. Right. So you don't need to read the detail of this. You're probably screaming at the screen going, I can't read any of that. But the point is just to show you what a research and innovation agenda looks like. And as you can see, we actually asked each team to think about quite a number of different things. So we asked them to identify an aim, to think about a motto, to think about some research objectives. What are the innovations that they actually want to create? So we kept sort of emphasizing this is about experimental governance, it's about innovation. You've got to produce something, you can't just talk forever. So each of them had to specify their innovations. They had to talk about the resources and the methods that they were going to apply, and they had to even think about giving that a kind of timeline of development. So it was quite a detailed process, and each lab produced one of these together, and then as time went by, they modified it as the work progressed. And as you'll see, not all of them met the objectives that they were trying to achieve. So I see if that works. So this is a summary of just 4 labs I think I've got there, and it shows you the idea to put this together again was just to show the amount of work actually that each lab in the end completed as part of this project. So you can see, for instance, how they applied slightly different methods even in the envisioning phase. So they were all tasked with producing a research and innovation agenda, but then they mobilized different methods to help build that agenda. Then you can see the work that was then conducted to do the experimental and experiencing work. Some labs, the Gloucestershire lab, for instance, prioritized a series of innovation projects at the experiencing stage. What you can start to also see is that some labs didn't really do what we call experiencing, and they just said we were just really in this experimental phase, and that's essentially what we did. So the Lisbon lab is a good example of that. As I'll show you in a moment, we had our own broader evaluation framework, but each lab was also doing their own monitoring and evaluation of their meetings and stuff. So we were taking that part of the process really quite seriously, because we said it was so critical to doing this sort of work well. So that's the first phase. That's what we call the kind of envisioning phase. I'm going to walk you through the other phases a little bit more quickly in terms of the detail of what was produced. But as you can see on this table, what we were constantly doing was producing summary tables to try and get people to think about what is it that you're actually experimenting with in this project? How does that relate to rural-urban linkages? How will it allow us to go back to the commission and say, look at what we've come up with as a consequence of using Living Labs? What's the inputs and data you're going to create? What's the outcomes going to be from that process? What are you actually going to deliver to your local economies? So we were trying to get people to align their experiments with influencing actual governance process. So if you take the ADA example, for instance, they eventually majored on circular farming, and that was designed to influence the rural spatial plan, or at least a draft of it. In the Gloucestershire lab, we actually decided to work on 3 experiments, and each of those we were trying to align them with specific aspects of work done through Gloucestershire County Council and related partners. So we really kept emphasizing this link between actual delivery of outcomes at the end of the process. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few moments' time. So what we found over the course of this experimenting, and actually in many cases, it kind of was experimenting, and those two phases are a little bit blurry. I actually wouldn't worry about them too much, but what happened was a kind of prioritization of governance innovation. And also we started to see different types of projects coming out. So you can see there that there was different types of things being produced, from kind of new knowledge and data through to kind of visioning exercises to much more concrete outcomes like very practical tools. They were definitely a space for dialogue, but of course what happened in the middle of our work was the COVID pandemic, which had quite a significant impact on a lot of the work in the labs. And the Mid Wales team used this idea of experimentation by proxy, which I think is a nice way to think about it. So a lot of the labs had to adapt their work, and so they didn't maybe get down to the innovation projects that they were hoping to. So they ended up doing kind of online interviews of existing innovations and stuff to try and fill in that space. So we had to manage and work through the COVID pandemic during the course of this project. So in this slide, what I'm trying to show really is, I've called it experiencing, but it's thinking about the governance innovations that were actually created. So what we tried to do in this slide, and again, you don't need to worry too much about the detail, but it's trying to think about, out of these labs, what types of things have actually come out from them? What types of things have been created? So you can't see it very well because it's at the bottom there, Julie, but there's sorry, but there's a little code, there's a little set of codes which we've created. So these are the innovation themes. Put that up there out of the way, Julie. Thanks very much. And you can see that we've then tried to map those across into different types of rural-urban linkage. So, for example, quite a few labs actually did end up producing new data or new knowledge. But there was also some very interesting work which was around this idea of kind of visioning and new policy development. So actually creating novel policy ideas down to good practice examples and tools. So we've then looked at very specifically at some of those and align them to different ways that you can strengthen links between rural and urban. So if you take the top one, for instance, proximity economy, you can see things like, the development of indicators for a kind of food dashboard in EDA. Dynamic procurement was one in Gloucestershire. That's a novel policy tool. There was some visioning work that was done particularly by the Lisbon team. And quite some new data as well was coming through. So we tried to code these things and align them to rural-urban linkages, because at the end of the day, that's what the Commission were most interested in, not how exciting our discussions were in the labs themselves. Or at least that's, so it's done it again, Julie.
Yeah,
I think when you move it, it doesn't like it. Anyway, we're learning as we go, which is exciting. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, move that down there. That's good, Julie. Well done. That's slightly in the way. So this is the evaluating phase. Thanks, Julie. So again, this is the fourth phase. This was ongoing through the project. And I guess the point of this slide is to emphasize how we built quite a detailed evaluation methodology for the project. So Marina was studying living labs for her PhD. So she's just got her PhD through the Robust project, which is brilliant, and through this evaluation work. So a lot of the credit goes to Marina for the excellent work that she did on this. But we decided that we needed a dedicated resource on this stuff because we wanted to take it really seriously. So what we did was we created a series of longitudinal surveys over the course of the project, and we developed a set of questions based on monitoring and learning literature that was used. And then alongside that, we had a series of kind of midterm, softer data collection points as well. So we did a series of interviews, Marina did, and we also had a series of case studies as well. So it was a combination of methods to get quite a rich data set. Do you need me to shut up quite soon, Julie? 30 minutes. Okay, grand. Okay, so I'm not rabbiting on too much then. So it's done it again. Sorry. Oh, this is smooth, isn't it? So very briefly, he says in the next hour or so, not really, but just some headlines of what we were doing. So in the analysis, what we were interested in was, were the labs meeting their goals that they set? And what was the nature of the collaboration in terms of this research practice dynamic? What came back from the longitudinal results, basically, is that it was a bit of a mixed bag, and it wasn't all positive. So you can see here, for example, that in terms of some of the content, so when we asked partners, you know, do you think through this work we've helped to improve governance arrangements, planning instruments? It was quite mixed. Have we enhanced cooperation and fostered synergies? In only a couple of the labs, they felt they'd made significant progress. There was a sense of an overall benefit, but what we found was that, you know, there was a very strong positive thought at the start, then a real dip, and I'll show you a table in a moment which shows that. So we think there's a number of reasons to kind of explain some of this stuff. Part of it's linked to COVID, part of it's maybe having super high expectations at the start and then thinking, oh, okay, this is a bit more of a pain than we thought, it's not quite what we thought, etc. But also there's an issue about time span, which I'll come back to at the end as well. So this is just one of the graphs that Marina produced from her longitudinal work with the labs, where we asked them to a series of questions and we repeated them over those 3 survey points. And what you can sort of see from that is basically how quite a lot of the labs, they were quite positive at the start. There was a real dip in the kind of midterm evaluation, and then for most labs they came back up. There was one outlier who I don't know why they got involved in the project, to be honest. I mean, look at how negative they were at the start. It's incredible. But anyway, it's another story. But so it's a kind of mixed pattern, but there's a real drop off, particularly from that early engagement point. But you can see some of the benefits in terms of new relationships, new knowledge, and, you know, and addressing an important issue as well. I don't want to be too negative. The other thing that's quite interesting at a more reflective level is this idea of actually the different ways that the labs worked. I'm beginning to call them co-innovation pathways, which is maybe a bit fancy, but essentially, I think there are some labs that adopted a more strategic, policy-orientated approach. I'll show you the Wales work, which is an example of that. And then there were other labs which focus much more on practice approaches and specific innovation. So you have a little bit of a difference there, which I think is quite interesting to observe, at least in Robust. In reality, most of them didn't get much beyond experimentation. COVID was partly a reason for that, I think. And I've also started to think about this idea of, you know, did we actually create, you know, radical innovation, transformative innovation? Initially, I was a little bit skeptical, but as I'll show you in a moment, when we've begun to pull all the data together, a strong narrative does come through, actually, which challenges and Liz Truss wouldn't like to hear this, but it's kind of conventional thinking on growth, for instance, and the need to think about a different way of thinking about rural-urban relationships through well-being, which actually is quite critical of the conventional, you know, sort of economic discourse. There's also a strong influence of both local and national politics in some of the labs. The EDA one in particular. So by the end of their work, they couldn't really engage with some of the farming community because of the broader politics and the broader shift that was happening in terms of some of the environmental regulations. So a lot of these experimental works are happening in context, both local and national, which can have an influence on the final outcomes. So just to very quickly give you a sense then of these 2 examples of a kind of more strategic versus a more practice one. This is the work that Mike and his colleagues produced. Bryony was involved in this work as well. And initially, I was wondering where they were going with it, because they were trying to bring together 9 local government agencies across Mid Wales. It was really ambitious. But then out of nowhere, they sort of produced this rural vision for Wales. I was like, wow, this is incredible. So they adopted in the end this really much more strategic way of thinking about it, and a series of really helpful documents, an evidence report, and also a manifesto which was developed with the governance association and the participants. So it's a really interesting outcome from their particular work, and I would say quite different to somewhere like Gloucestershire, where we focused really in on three particular governance experiments. This is one of them, which is the dynamic procurement experiment. So we majored in on the school food contract that the Gloucestershire County Council had and said, right, how can we change that to get more local food coming into these schools? And so we said, let's try and use the dynamic procurement platform as the way to do that. And so that's one of the things that we focused our work on. The other one was linked to circular economy, and the other one was linked to natural flood management. And actually, Chris, you were involved with Dan as well in that. So what we ended up doing, which is quite different to what the more strategic one does, was we ended up with things like this, where we tried to get a change in wording in the contract for the next school food contract that was to be issued. We didn't get as far as implementing the dynamic procurement platform for a number of reasons, but we did actually get this wording into the call, the tender that went out for new tenderers, so that they would continue to look at this as a future priority. So a bit of a win there. I think Chris and Dan probably had the strongest win in terms of what they did on the flood management side. We also managed to get some changes on the circular economy side as well, which Matt was leading on. But two quite different approaches. This is a table that I won't bore you with too much, but it's just to show how we had to then try to pull together all these very specific experiments and detail at the local level to try and make a bigger argument about rural growth and rural-urban linkages, which is what the Commission wanted to see coming from the work. So we eventually came up with a series of dimensions of well-being, which you can see on the left there, and then we're able to align these particular experiments to those particular ways of thinking about what we were calling a kind of more foundational economy perspective on growth, with services at the centre of that. So I'm coming to the close, you'll probably be pleased to know. So just to pull out some kind of broader level learnings, which applies to maybe some of the projects we've got in the Institute at the moment, certainly applies to lots of Horizon Europe projects that will for sure continue to use living labs going forward. So at the point of our work, I would say it was definitely a new concept and approach. It does provide a good framework for co-production, but a great deal of time is needed to kind of plan it and to implement it well, to communicate things like the goals and the principles, to make sure everyone has that kind of collective understanding. You do need quite a bit of flexibility in your plans and your schedules. And you need to take very seriously the need to have constant monitoring and evaluation. That really is quite an important facet to get that kind of reflexivity coming through if you have an innovation plan or whatever you decide to do. I think for some of our researchers, for us, it was a little bit of we were slightly out of our comfort zone, because sometimes it felt like you were in a kind of facilitation process, which maybe we're less experienced at. So there's a new challenge there. And our kind of story, really, our big message, which went back to the Commission, was if you want to persist with these types of projects, which we think you should, then you need to give them more time. In fact, you might need to be thinking about funding projects in the region of 7 to 8 years, for instance, if you want real impact and change. And teams need to maybe think about strategies to build preparatory phases, even pre a proposal, so that you can really get up and running quite quickly when the work gets going. So I've probably rabbited on for far too long, Julie, so I'll stop there. And thanks for listening. Thanks to all the C2I colleagues who took part. Just to say, there is a very good, robust website, which I've included at the bottom there, which has lots and lots of great materials that folks can use, including our toolkit and the synthesis report. So thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Damian.
No problem.
We'll be having some questions now. Katerina's monitoring the chat, I think. And I can start off by taking any questions in the room that I'm in. Julie?
I've got a question, really, a
Okay.
comment, on your last point there about the time it takes to do this stuff and the need for a preparatory phase. We're coming up with exactly the same sorts of things in the co-production work we've done. And I think the challenge is to get that message across to, well, in particular, DEFRA from your perspective. Because all the work that we've done, we've been putting forward those recommendations that this stuff takes a long time, particularly in low trust environments with stakeholders. So you need that time to develop those relationships, put together memorandums of understanding of how you want this design co-production thing to work, before you even start doing any of the work.
Yeah.
But what we tend to see, and we just had a tender come through from DEFRA wanting something done in 3.5 months, which is bonkers.
Yeah.
So I think the challenge is to get that message across that it takes time and that it's got to be a longer term investment. But like you said, 7 or 8 years.
Probably.
Massive investment.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And I guess the key for people who are funding that is that investment with value for money. That's a challenge, isn't it?
It is a challenge, and yeah, it takes a long time to build up those the kind of common trust. And we worked really well actually with our Gloucestershire lab in the end, but I think we spent quite a long time just getting to know each other and kind of figuring out what we were actually doing. I mean, to be honest, we didn't kind of know to start with. It was a bit of a mess. I was like, oh my God, what are we going to do? I don't know. So we had loads of meetings with them to try and they didn't really know what we were on about half the time. So it took a long time to even figure out what we were doing as a lab, let alone coordinate the other labs. And I think everyone was in that same sort of space. But yeah, I don't think a lot of these funding bodies quite get it, because they just put out a new call for sustainable food initiatives type idea. I don't know if you've seen that go out, but it was kind of modeled on the test and trial thing. But you look at their time frame, it's way off. Yeah. You need to double that time. I mean, I didn't say that to them, but I looked at it and thought, that's ridiculous. You're not going to do that.
I'm just going to use my chair's prerogative.
Sorry, Julie.
Dive in. No, I was just going to say that echoes so many other multi-actor papers that have come out recently, because we've got to the point now where we can pause and reflect about this multi-actor approach. And then so many people are saying the same thing as well. So collectively, this voice is coming out to say we've got to have more time. We've got to understand that this envisaging or this priority setting takes a very long time. You're not just zooming into a vacuum. You're working in a particular context with people that have got what's going on. Facilitation, context, those are all issues that have come up a lot of times before. Yeah, sorry to dive in, Christian.
Well, and does legacy come up too? Because that's it. The other point we found in our natural flood management bit. It works. We've got a subgroup now, regional flood and coastal committee. Yeah. Of course, robust is finished. So it's very difficult for us to justify the time to get involved. And they're going, well, we've set this group up. Now, where are they?
What next?
Yeah,
what next?
I know.
So they're expecting us to be involved, and we're feeling really difficult because there isn't any reason for us to be involved with projects.
Yeah, that's right. So like, do we use impact money?
Exactly.
What do we do? Because I mean, we'd love to keep the dynamic procurement stuff going, especially if you invest like 4.5 years of your lifetime, get involved, and then it just stops. And,
so it's notion that just as you've got them on board and they understand what you mean.
Yeah, and
you just
it goes back as well to the kind of one of those principles around kind of leadership and stuff. I mean, I think it does need. In the end, I think the academic group did have to kind of drive it forward a bit. And so once the funding stops, with the best will in the world, if you haven't got the resource to keep the momentum going, it just drifts away, and it just becomes another project. And you start out by saying, this is not like your standard project, this is proper co-production, you know, we're going to leave a footprint, and then it just dies. Yeah.
Anyway, moving on.
Sorry.
There's a question from Anna. Hello, Anna. In the chat here, do you think that there are advantages in using government bodies instead of organisations, NGOs, and living labs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure whether there are advantages necessarily. I mean, I guess it's maybe it's a different type of co-relationship that you have with them. I mean, certainly I'd not worked before with the county council in Gloucestershire. In fact, I mean, they did have advantages in terms of the fact that they were really well networked and could connect us up, and we ended up working with lots of people in the council and realizing what an incredibly large organization it was. Having said that, there are things that you have to take on board around their kind of processes of governance, which are really slow, and decision-making processes are really quite structured and stuff. So there are good points of working with them, but also they can be, you know, not so easy to work with. I think some of the labs, I mean, it's interesting to look at what's happening in some of in the States, for example, and in Canada. They have quite different ways of working. Some of them, the university, they tend to design a lab linked to a campus, and so it's really kind of driven through the university. Others are working much more with kind of community groups and things. So I think you have to think carefully about, okay, if we're going to work with a government body, what's that going to be like, and accept that it's going to, you know, come with some advantages, but also some disadvantages.
Is there a reason you asked that question, Anna? Do you want to elaborate? Or?
No, well, I was wondering if maybe if you're working with the government body that you can have more like a larger impact, perhaps, because it can actually lead to some political changes at the government level that whereas a small organization maybe has less of an impact of on society, but I'm not sure if that was a criteria in a way for this project.
I mean, it probably was, in the sense that we were looking at rural-urban linkages, we were looking at spatial planning, those types of issues, which were quite embedded in a lot of local, you know, government organisations. They had some expertise and stuff, and you probably think, yes, they will be able to then grab hold of it, leave a legacy, and so forth. But sometimes that can be an expectation that doesn't quite end up going that way because of how slow it takes them to decide things, how structured they are, the size of the organisation, all those kind of things.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. We have two comments.
Yes, go on, Julie.
Bryony, you have a comment.
Yes, I really wanted to reiterate, Damian made the point right at the start that he was going to emphasize experimentation, and increasingly I think this is so important. I've been tracking what I shall politely call another institution, which is setting up living labs, and I attended their kickoff meeting with a lot of stakeholders, and they're actually very resistant to the idea of experimentation. There's this sort of idea that, you know, we can't experiment upon people, and it comes in from the tech industry, and heaven forbid we've got to be left of centre green academics and not like the tech industry at all, even though we're having a meeting on Zoom. And I think what this ends up with is just essentially what they're scheduling is a bunch of workshops, which is nice. But I think if we are going to the Commission and asking for 7-year funding on projects, and they're seeing things come through, which is essentially what we were doing anyway, it's just not going to happen. So I think in terms of developing the methodology, it really is bringing that experimentation element forward. Otherwise, we're just going to lose it.
Yeah, I fully support that, Bryony. And I think I don't know, I just kept going along to meetings, repeating things each time. Hi everybody, lovely to all see you all again. Right, here's what we're supposed to be doing, and showing them these kind of tables about, you know, the need to have governance, experimentation, and to actually produce something at the end of it. I was really worried that we were going to have like 4.5 years of just discussing stuff, you know. It's just, wow, what's the point in doing that, you know? So so yeah, I think you have to think about what it is that is distinctive about living labs as a methodology, and experimentation is definitely one of them. And so too are things like taking really seriously the fact that it is co-innovation, it is co-production, it is user-centered experimentation, and therefore you need to build it in through those principles and really do it that way. Otherwise, just go and do a case study and don't call it a living lab, because it's not. The end. You know, I think maybe it's one of those terms that's just been used a little bit too loosely now, which is not very helpful.
Yeah, Richard, you have a comment too.
Yes, I kind of wanted to be reassuring of Damian that actually it was a good investment, because I've challenged this myself. I don't know if he knows, but I first of all got myself involved in one of these multinational products funded by the European Commission, called Volanti, which was called Visions of Land Use in the Future of Europe. And it was pretty frustrating. We had lots of workshops, we pulled things together, we thought about various issues, and the timescale came to an end and the project wasn't quite finished and written up. But what it was trying to do was to set out how best to use the finite and increasingly challenged land asset in the European nations. And I think it was on the back of that I found myself asked to be on the steering group for Horizon project priorities. And in fact, I found myself chairing the group that actually identified recommended the priorities for research. And sometime after that, well, we did our best to identify the things which were crucial issues, but that had read across Europe in different ways, that people could learn from each other in the research communities. Because the strength of Volanti and the strength of these multinational groups is that you automatically share knowledge and contacts and build a much stronger research capacity across all the member states. And so the fact that you did work in a lot of countries, and some of it seemed to work and some of it didn't, and it didn't really achieve very much somewhere, you did achieve a great deal, because in the view of the team in Brussels, that was part of the purpose, is to have the interchange of knowledge, and not only knowledge but ways of working across the whole research capacity, as it were, across the EU and other members who are still involved in it. So I think that was, I think that in a way your frustration is that perhaps there might have been a solution that could have been applied everywhere, when in fact the main goal was to show what might work, what might not work, but also to join up the research networks across Europe, and also sprinkle some ideas. And those ideas, when sprinkled, and if they're written up in various ways, and if people like you engage now back in our region and say, well, in this part of the, sorry, I didn't write down all the countries you worked in, but in this area, they were doing this and it was really fascinating, and you can do something. And because, you know, many of the initiatives that are actually making a difference are not invented locally, they're copied from somewhere else. You know, Chris is not visual visit, but what he knows I'm going to say is that if it hadn't been for Stroud that did some natural flood management work, we wouldn't have actually had the catchment scheme for the Isbourne. And if we then didn't bid for the money for the Isbourne, there wouldn't be a catchment scheme for somewhere over in Worcestershire, almost feeding into the river. And so something which might have started with a rather abstract research, is this going to work or not? The links and the join up in your community and other communities should make a difference. And therefore, to me, this idea of co-production does mean that everybody who is a part of a co-production is actually helping to ensure that regions are better equipped to deal with the challenges, and that the academic input to asking the difficult questions from time to time and making sure that the funds are actually spent well is actually an extremely good outcome of the investment. So we shouldn't see European revolutions arising out of this, but what we should see is all parts of Europe increasingly learning that if you approach topics by researching them properly, then your funds are probably better invested and the outcomes are better outcomes than they would otherwise have been. And so someone who's worked at senior levels in government, and as I said, played around a bit in some of the research sector, I wanted to commend the work and reassure you that I'm sure it is valuable. And I'm actually involved in a project at the moment which is coming to an end, another European project, which I'm on the side of assessing how well that research is doing. And to me, the biggest challenge is how to get into the European Commission machinery and fill in the forms and all of those sorts of things. I think that's probably another good skill that you guys have actually achieved, whereas I come back every 6 months.
Yes, brilliant.
Thanks,
We've just
Richard.
got one very quick question here from Chris, and then we'll have to wrap up because we need to vacate the room.
Oh, is it a question, Chris? Yeah. Sorry, Chris.
I didn't know if you had links with ENAC, the European Network of Living Labs.
No.
So, because I don't, it'd be interesting to know if they take a different approach, particularly around the legacy.
I think they were quite influential in some of the urban living lab stuff, actually.
It is, but yeah, they can evolve beyond urban.
Yeah, I think they had a strong initial influence in some of that.
They're clearly, I think, trying to capture and pull people in.
Yeah.
Around this, how they be interested in how they see.
Yeah, I mean, I think
going.
there is because there's so many of these projects now, and a bit, as Richard says, it's quite good to sort of maybe connect them up a bit to think about, well, where's the intersecting points of learning that we can pull together for like this type of stuff, really.
Yeah.
And I think there are probably some people already doing that. I mean, there are quite a few kind of desk-based review papers of living labs, but it'd be maybe a good time to pull together a set of projects which were maybe more rural development and rural urban, in our kind of domain. There's probably a need to do a bit of that now, actually. But I haven't connected with them. But no, I appreciate Richard's comments as well. They're really, really reassuring, actually, and helpful.
Well, from what you were saying, I think that the former Countryside Agency was probably a living lab creator. So we went out and did innovative things with communities and so on, and then published them and said, this is a good way of working. Hence community forests, hence natural flag management. We mustn't be frightened by the academic terms. It's probably quite difficult to sell things as academic terms, but actually if you sell them as other people's ideas that have worked elsewhere, and you'll suddenly discover they are actually living labs.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, many thanks to Damian for a stimulating talk.
Thank you, everybody. Fine.
And please join us next month, and we have Anna here and Dan.
Yeah. Thanks to all the CCRI folks that took part in the Robust project. I think I mentioned everybody. Forgot Chris at the beginning, but I did mention at the end, Chris, sorry. So thanks to everyone who helped with the project. They're all brilliant. So thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.